Hello, everyone, and welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, and evening. It is a true pleasure to be with you today for the side panel discussion as part of the 2023 OECD Forum on Due Diligence in the Garment and Footwear sector. My name is Lauren Murphy. I'm the Global Director of the Advisory Practice at the International Center for Research on Women. I'm here based in DC, and I'm joined for today's panel by two colleagues in the field, Bijie and Vera Belazelkoska. Bijie heads client services at Labor Solutions, and she leads the implementation of their worker tech tools and advisory program. And Vera is the director of programs at Ululu, where she leads a team on program design, methodology, implementation, and data. And we've come to you today for a panel on worker voice with a gender lens. And I should also say this work represents the broader ICRW team composed of Rachel Oguntola, past colleague Yona Rapishti, and Julia McIntyre. And so we're here today to speak around what is worker voice and why does it matter to bring a gender lens to this work. And so the session outline for today is in 4 parts. For about 45 minutes, we'll be talking around what is worker voice and why do worker surveys need to be gender responsive? What does it mean to develop gender responsive questions? And we'll then share the results of a gender equity worker voice pilot that we've done over the past year with 7 participating brands. And then we will move on to Q&A so we can hear from all of you joining us today in this session to talk about the work itself and the results that we found in this pilot. So the first part is, what is gender responsive worker voice? And why do survey questions need to be gender responsive? So worker voice itself is not new, but a gender lens is in this work. And worker voice really began about a decade ago when brands started to more fully engage with and interview and survey workers to find out more about their insights and lived experience, largely starting with the apparel and footwear sector. And this was due for motivations due to reputational risk and to preempt critical NGO and watchdog reports. This was a decade ago when this work started. And since then, efforts have expanded considerably. And so what is worker voice? Worker voice is a process, it's a set of actions to collect insights, sentiments, and reflections from workers. And there's no one way to do this. It can be done through surveys, through interviews, through focus group discussions, which we will talk about today in our work. And factory managers can use these insights to complement compliance audits. They can use it to deepen social dialogue with workers and get really honest input about what is working and what is not for workers. And importantly, this leads to better action and programming at the factory floor. It really is an effort to help workers feel valued and heard, and it feeds into action planning. So why is this work important? And it's important from both a business benefit level and a worker well-being level. And so we know that gender inequity in supply chains is multifaceted and pervasive. Women face different pressures, social norms, risks, and demands in the supply chain globally, across sectors, across countries. We've highlighted 3 key areas here where we often see gender disparities, and this is in leadership, wages, and safety. So we know that women make up far less of the management ranks in factories. Nearly half of the global workforce, for example, is made up of women, but yet only about a third make up supervisory roles. There can be wage discrepancies, and this is largely due to occupational segregation in factories. We know that women tend to compose the lower skilled, lower remunerated ranks in the supply chain. And so this can lead to lower pay. And then finally, safety of women. We know that sexual harassment, violence, and discrimination in the workplace is pervasive. And so as we develop greater insights into women's lived experience, this has both benefit to the woman and to the men with which she works. And that also has better business value in terms of increased productivity, decreased turnover and absenteeism, et cetera. And so given this, the question is why now, and why integrate gender more explicitly into worker voice? And this is because worker voice to date as a practice somewhat overlooks the key questions that are of most important to women, the key areas of opportunity and risk that represent disproportionate impact to their well-being. And we know that the women's vulnerabilities are systematically underreported in worker voice surveys. Most worker surveys disaggregate men and women on questions, for example, but the questions themselves are not targeting the particular risk and opportunity for women. And that's what we've done in our work with our partner brands that we're excited to share with you today. And importantly, when we fail to surface problems, we can't solve for them. So that's what this effort is. It's deeper insight into women's lived experience to generate more insights and ultimately better action planning and response between factory managers and workers. Also, no gold standard on this work exists. And so the impetus for us at ICRW to create this worker voice gender questionnaire was to put forward a set of public good questions that are available to the public that are the best approximation for a standardized set of questions that can be used to further tap into women's lived experience. Okay. So that's a little bit of the framing of what this work is in terms of the value it can bring to the space. What we did is we partnered in a multi-brand, multi-country pilot, and we called it JWEG, the Gender Equity Worker Engagement Group. I know many of our member companies are joining today, so a huge thank you to all of you who are on the line that have been part of this process over the past year. And it's a group of 7 leading apparel and footwear brands, as well as multi-sector retailers, including Amazon, Primark, Nike, Puma, Ralph Lauren, and a few others. And importantly, 6 of their suppliers. They opened their doors to 6 of their suppliers across 3 countries, where we tested, refined, iterated, and polished these questions. So a huge thank you to those who put forward their factories for this work. We partnered with Labor Solutions in Ululu. Vera and Bijie are here on the line, and we'll hear from them in a few moments about their experience with this work and the insights it's unlocked. And then finally, we worked with external advisors, namely Lake Advisory, and a selection of academics in worker voice. And the why behind why we did this work is it stems from work that the International Center for Research on Women has done through the years on a diagnostic tool at the factory level called the Gender Equity Self-Diagnostic Tool, or SDT. And this was initially seeded by Nike, and other brands have joined in for its deployment. It's now across 2,000 factories globally. And this work is the best policy and practice for gender equity at the factory level. And this is self-reported, so it's essentially a gender self-assessment questionnaire. So supplier managers fill it out. And there is this desire to see how we can better contextualize that information coming from the factory managers, from this self-diagnostic tool. And so in came this work on worker voice in this pilot to see how we can contextualize and compare what factory managers are saying with what workers are saying. Where are we converging? Where are they diverging? And where do we see differences? And where do we see differences in opinion? Really to unlock greater insights around women's lived experience and then the resulting action that can ensue. So what did it mean for us to create gender responsive questions? We, again, because this work in theory, as a practice is not new, we looked to the prior state of surveys that had been made. So we collected 15 worker voice surveys, which represented around 467 questions, so quite a bit. So we scanned the globe and said, what is out there in worker voice? We then created an analysis framework to say, how are questions being asked by theme, by gender, by typology? And we created a way to both look at these questions and identify gaps, or where are new questions needed to be written? And what will be the most effective framework in which to do so. So we created that framework, we validated it with industry experts, and we began to finesse these questions in terms of their structure, how to bundle the questions, and how to frame the questions to women to get the most honest answers. And so this is what the framework looks like. There are 4 different types of questions. So going from 1 to 4, 1, this can be a question around fact, and this is usually more compliance-based. So is there a policy or not? Is there a training or not? A lot of these types of questions are captured in audit and compliance data. We then have level 2, which is a question around understanding or satisfaction with a policy or practice. So this is more around worker perception of are there accountability structures? Do they trust that these policies and practices are being implemented? Third is actual personal experience with one of the topics being discussed. So this happened to me, or I've seen it happen in my workplace. And then 4 is really the most focused on real root causes and social norms around shame potentially, or power dynamics that are harder to uncover in a simple question. So this was the typology that we used from 1 to 4 to order all of these questions and our own group thinking around what's going to be the most impactful entry points to get the most nuanced information from women workers. And so this is an example of what it looks like. For the 4 areas, the 4 pieces of the typology. And then on the right, you'll see 1, my company provided gender-based violence training in a language I understand. So this is a yes, no. It's a fact. The company provided the training. 2 is if I reported a case of GBVH, I trust that my employer would address it. So this is an example of moving beyond the existence of a policy or practice and saying, I feel comfortable, there's accountability here. 3 is, again, this personal experience. So a manager has made an unwelcome sexual remark or physical contact with me or others at work. So this gets more into the personal realm of lived experience. And then 4, the more pushing the boundaries on real root cause is a question around if a woman has been abused and reports it, she'll bring shame to her family. So you can see here how we go from 1 being the most yes, no policy or practice in place to real deeper questions around social norms. As a group of 7 brands, advisors, and ICRW, we really focused our efforts more in 2 and 3 because we felt that was the most rich and feasible data collection entry points to be launching these questions at the factory level. And we'll talk more around one day getting more into level 4 as an industry and how we can move the field forward. And so these are the different areas in which we ask questions. So you'll see 3 major pillars. So talent practices, worker well-being, and cross-cutting themes. And so you'll see these are the areas that we unpacked. And with this group of 7 brands, we decided to really focus more heavily on the areas you'll see in orange. So employee evaluation and promotion, compensation, gender-based violence and harassment, or GBVH, child and elderly care, and employee health, safety, and well-being. Why is because these we felt as a group, and based on the topology you saw, were the highest opportunity and impact areas to make change for women in their lived experience. So the question set that we're talking about today that we piloted in total is 21 across these 10 themes, which with emphasis on the areas you see in orange. Okay, so now we will get to the actual pilot, which is here. So we had 3 countries, China, Indonesia, and Vietnam. In total, there were around 1,800, just over, participants in 6 factories with 3 brands that put forward their factories in these 3 countries. You'll see the country and respondent breakdown here. There was a statistically representative sample in each. To note, there's a 2-part pilot. We had a actual worker voice survey, which we'll now talk about with Bijie and with Vera. So we deployed these questions using the Labor Solutions and Ululu as our survey vendors. And then we followed up with focus group discussions. So, and these discussions really asked the participants 3 main things. Their ease of understanding. So were the questions concise? Were they comprehensible? The second was, did they feel like they had enough information to answer? Did they feel like they had the knowledge to truly answer the question? And then third, were they intimidated to answer? Did the questions pose any risk to them, or were they embarrassed to answer, or did they fear retribution in some form or fashion? So we contextualized the actual survey deployment with the face-to-face contact of a focus group discussion. So we had The survey included both men and women, although the respondents were predominantly women, and the focus group discussions were only women. And these were the overall findings. In short, there were no questions that seemed particularly difficult to answer and no major outliers. And in fact, the women also felt that there were no major camps of questions that were missing. They did feel that the question set was comprehensive. We saw the highest scores are related to safety, health, and well-being, and gender-based violence and harassment, which suggests that these participants feel that they have adequate health services and protective equipment, for example, and that they're confident and show a level of trust in the GBVH reporting systems. So action is being taken, and they're feeling that trust in the system compared to the other areas of measure. This does not mean, just because they're high does not mean they're perfect scores. There's still work to be done, but comparatively, these two rose to the top compared to the other areas of measure. Similarly, the lowest scores are related to discrimination and support for working parents in care. So this suggests that compared to the other areas of measure, potentially fewer policies and best practices were taking place to support caregivers, as well as to create structures of accountability for discrimination. Two key curiosities I'd like to flag too before we launch into our discussion with Bijie and Vera are: one, we saw in many instances that men and women responded similarly. And curiously, potentially counterintuitively, some women responded more positively than men. And we will get into that discussion in a moment. And as well, we saw that a key differentiator was tenure in the factory. So those who have longer number of years, so more than 3, often score higher than new hires. So we don't know the why behind this yet, although we can conjecture, but this would require, really unpacking both would require broader scale piloting. And I would also say, please, as we go through, please put any questions you might have in the chat, in the Q&A, so we can be sure at the end we have about 15 minutes at the end of this presentation to come back to Q&A. Okay. So I would invite Vera and Bijie to come online. And really, we're going to open a discussion around our five key learnings in this work, and to hear from them. As mentioned, they both represent 2 organizations that were in the factories for the deployment of this pilot, and had the one-on-one exposure to and learning from workers and managers in the process. So I want to start first with this. Our first learning really is that there's a widening aperture to talk about gender. And this came both from the factory managers who were open about this deployment of these new questions, as well as the workers, particularly women, who are excited about the particular gendered questions posed here. And so I want to start first, Vera, with you around the piloting process. And curious if you could speak to any shift in the factory manager's openness to talk about gender equity, and how you felt the survey helped in that process.
Thank you, Lauren, and a pleasure to be here. I think that's a great question to start with. I mean, just to set the stage, obviously this was a voluntary process. So our partner brands invited suppliers, and they opted in. So there's of course, a certain level of interest in the topic off the bat. This wasn't for example, a sampling process where we have a very wide variety of suppliers. So I would say already we have the suppliers opting in might have a higher level of interest and maturity on the topics of gender. So I think right away we had a good baseline, but it might not necessarily be as representative of how factories generally feel about the topic. We found that the feedback was quite positive, and we had the experience of deploying 2 different methodologies. With one of our participating suppliers, we deployed the entire gender-based survey, and the other group of suppliers, they deployed the EWB methodology and then a selection of gender-based questions. So we actually wove the ICRW question set into the EWB, which is a much more general set of questions that touch on topics that are not always just through a gender lens. And the openness to both methodologies was quite high. The first supplier, for example, they are already part of a program, continuous program of digital worker engagement. So adding this component didn't seem like a lot to ask. And the general feedback was that this is very interesting and they were quite open to it. They also have a bit of higher maturity because they're part of different programs like the BSR Her project. So already I think we had a certain level of interest. And in the second group of suppliers where we deployed the EWB with the gender-based questions, there was an interest, especially because it's a methodology that's slightly modified. And I think we built more interest with the number of calls that we had. So we had kickoff call, then introductory call, methodology. We tried to reduce the burden so that they know that this is a simple program to deploy, but they also were really keen to understand why are we doing it, how we will do it, what will be the implication of results. So through those conversations, we saw greater and greater openness to the process. And then I think now post-survey, the biggest focus is on finding out why are the results the way they are, which again opens up another opportunity for us to engage with them on topics of gender. And I think this is actually where the work starts.
Thank you, Vera, and thank you too for clarifying. Yes, as part of this work, there are it's one question set, and it's meant to be it can be a standalone question set that's cultivated around those 10 domains that we walked through. It's a public good, so it'll be on our website, and folks can choose the entire tool, all the questions, a portion of the questions, and there's a cultivated and curated short set of questions that are meant to be complementary to surveys that are already pre-existing, like the EWB Employee Wellbeing Survey. So thank you. And Bijie, I'll turn to you now too with a similar question around the aperture for the workers. Would love if you could speak to the unlocks you saw that, and particularly the second bullet here, of the women and their excitement around this gender angle and being asked these more nuanced questions.
Sure. Thank you, Lauren. So all of the workers who participated in our worker survey pilots, they voluntarily participated, right? So we have done a quite intensive promotion around the survey. So we used videos and promotional posters to really tell workers what the survey is about. We try to avoid using, big words such as gender equity. We try to relate the content of the poster and the survey to their real life experience. So during our focus group discussion with the workers, the participants told us that they were really intrigued to participate in the survey because they were interested to find out what they can talk about under this gender topic and what other workers might be thinking. And also one interesting finding that we got from the focus group discussion is when we touch upon the questions that we asked in the survey. Some of the workers told us that they were very interested because we were touching upon a diversifying themes in the surveys. Because during the audits or the previous surveys, the workers were quite used to being asked questions related to sexual harassment. So in a lot of workers' minds, sexual harassment is the core concept or equals to gender equity. So in this survey, obviously, it has given them a wider concept under this topic. And then before this survey, they rarely thought about gender equality as a much wider concept that is related to how they are hired, promoted, how they communicate, or even how they balance work and their family life, or even how their childcare support has been provided. So by going through these questions in the survey, the workers actually recall what they have experienced and they can relate. And I would also wanted to address on the type of questions in the survey, which to your earlier point, Lauren, about the different types of questions that we ask, which are going beyond fact checking. And we really start to ask workers about how they feel. For example, rather than asking the workers if the factories have a certain policies or procedures, we ask whether workers feel safe because of these policies and procedures. So when we ask this type of questions, workers can relate more to their experience and provide more personal answers based on their experience.
Great, thank you both. We'll move to the second finding, which is really around this iterative process of asking the right questions. It really takes a time, attention to detail, care, and iteration. And so as mentioned earlier, it went from a desk review to external validation, to the narrowing down the set, to then getting to pilot ready sets of questions, launching the actual questions, coming back, seeing the feedback we got, then going and doing focus groups, and then tweaking again. And so it's critical to get it right. And these small changes really matter, from particular translations of certain words that may not carry in certain cultural contexts, or getting from somewhat broad concepts to really getting narrow, to, excuse me, to then really getting to, trying our best to get to root cause, within the context of these questions, where it can be so hard to do. It's very, as mentioned before, it's very hard to push on that type 4 question, that the real node of social norms. And so what we did is we collected worker feedback, as mentioned. We, in the context of our type 2 and type 3 questions, pushed as far as we can in the context of a survey methodology. And then these focus groups were really important. So some things we learned in this process, right, were women of lower literacy levels had a harder time responding. We saw the posters in the factory floor incented folks to respond. And there was a lot of richness in the focus group discussions. So a question I have for both of you, and we can start with you, Bijie, is what are the tweaks, both big and small, that you feel that were most important, that came from the survey and from the focus group discussions? And are there any country level differences that you would raise in the process? So basically, how did we make it better in the process to where we are now?
Sure. I think from the focus group discussion, the biggest takeaways that we get is about the questions need to be relevant and needs to be put into context for the workers. So first of all, about relevancy, because we should not assume that the workers had experience or even paid attention to everything that we wanted to ask about. So we have to ask questions that are derived from their experience, and only by that we can get genuine perspectives from them. For example, the majority of the workers may not have experienced a very structured or systematic promotion, either because of the size of the factory or the way promotion works in the production floor. So it may not be a good idea when we ask about too many technicalities about promotion or how the promotion system works, because workers wouldn't know. Another example is that we see that most married women workers, usually age 25 and above, can easily give input for questions related to childcare support provided by the factories. But we do not see the same for unmarried women or men, because they do not have the experience, or they don't even pay attention to the facility, even if the factory has provided one. So in order for us to get more insightful results, we may want to think about breaking down the results by demographics during the analysis process. And the second point I wanted to talk about is the contextualization for workers. It is really to help workers fitting the questions into their work-life experience. And this, to some extent, means not to use very abstract or formal words. For example, we found that workers respond much better to the term bank transfer compared to digital payment. They also respond better to terms like learning a new machine or learning new sewing skills compared to adjusting production techniques. So oftentimes it is much easier for workers to answer a question when we give examples. And it is what we have recommended to the working group during the question refining stage. But I also wanted to highlight that we probably need to be more mindful about giving examples. We wanted to make sure it's right and generic, so that we do not limit the scope of the questions. To your last question, Lauren, in terms of the country comparison, to be honest, we see fewer differences among the countries compared to demographics, such as whether they're married, their age, their tenure, as you said, and as well as gender. So I think it is also highlighting the importance of having the questions workers can really relate to their own experience.
Thank you, Bijie. And the same questions to you, Vera, around the changes, both from the survey focus group and country level context you'd like to raise.
Yeah. And no, I want to mirror quite a bit of what Bijie said. I think working with the working group between all of us before the deployment, it helped us hone in on the right terminology. I think validating it with our teams in each country and really trying to identify a term that can be both relevant and accessible is always better than something that might be too technical. And I think when we design methodologies, we can get carried away and end up with quite a lot of technical terms. And I think a lot of time and attention was spent to illustrate what we're trying to ask rather than be extremely descriptive. So I think using some examples, but not communicating examples in a way where, as Bijie said, limits how the worker perceives the topic. One example of that was related to skills. One feedback that came back to us from our team in China, for example, was when we talk about skills, are we talking about what a worker needs to do their job currently effectively? Or are we talking about skills related to career progression and opportunity and things that are a little bit beyond what their current working experience is at the moment? So getting a bit clear about that, illustrating what we mean by it is not easy, but I think we were able to achieve a good balance. And of course, having deployed the surveys now, we have even more information because we even got to speak to workers about the questions themselves. So one of the virtual sessions that we were able to coordinate, it was in the middle of the COVID spread in China, so unfortunately couldn't be done in person, but it was still really, really valuable. We heard from workers about terminology like digital wage. For them, that's a really strange concept because it's been digital for a really long time. So there is no other type of wage. So for, this is maybe a country specific question, whereas if we were to deploy the survey in parts of South Asia, we really need to focus on both, the paper-based with pay slips versus digital versus bank transfers. So I think this is where we're beginning to learn some discrepancy as to how questions could be slightly varied in their translation per country. Because people in China said, but I don't know how to answer this. Like, this is how I get paid normally. So what's the difference? And then maybe I'll chime in on one other component. Through the engagement with workers about the question, we noticed that sometimes workers were confused about whether they're asked about the gender, always having a gender perspective to all the questions, or whether they're answering about everybody. And I think that's something we're going back to the drawing board with. For example, asking, is this a good place to work? Does it mean good place to work for women, or is it good place to work in general for all? So I think we got some really valuable feedback from workers that we would not have been able to project ourselves. And I think that's extremely important in designing something that will be open source, that brands can continue to use or adapt or pull a couple questions and introduce in different methodologies. So yeah, those are just a couple of lessons learned. And maybe I'll just close on the promotional materials. We did get some feedback on how we communicate the survey as well. And it was reiterated in multiple focus groups that the aspects of anonymity, gratuity were the most important. They came out clearly in the materials, and we need to always make sure that they're stressed and that they're front and center, because the confidentiality is the biggest concern when it comes to digital worker participation. So that seemed to be extremely important to workers, and they appreciated that was communicated right away in both our introductory messages and the promotional materials.
Thank you, Vera. Yeah, and this is such a good point around is good conditions for all versus good conditions specifically for women. And on that feedback, and I do see a question in the Q&A around where the questions are. They will be on our website shortly, and so you'll be able to see them there. And for those who do have a look, you will see framing where we moved the question architecture to put women at the beginning of the question. To this point that Vera is making. So for women in this factory, or I would recommend this as a good place to work to a close family member or friend, a female close family member or friend. So we really had to front load the questions given that feedback of like the distinction we're drawing with the question process. So thank you, Vera and Bijie. And I would say let's go over to this third learning, which is linked, in that we've really seen that education and awareness is integral to this work. As we were more in depth into factory, and again, as Vera mentioned, we had to adapt in China for the COVID realities of being virtual in some instances. But in both in person and virtual, we saw there's still a lot of blind spots around needs and what is gender work at the factory level, and that vendor work on sensitization and outreach is really critical for broader adoption of this work. And even terms, as Bijie was saying, and Vera were both saying earlier, of what does it mean to get a promotion? Like what actually does that mean, and what constitutes gender-based violence and harassment? If those foundational concepts, when they're defined well, it really helps and can help all workers respond better in a more nuanced and truthful way to the questions we're asking. So we very much see a role of training and sensitization before survey deployment, so that we're sure that workers and managers are really understanding the concepts being measured. That said, we saw the scores that came back from this effort really in line with other industry surveys in terms of how they were scoring, and it's somewhat high. And that's common when launching a first survey, because workers need to also trust, as was just mentioned, that they can trust the survey, their anonymity in the survey, and over time scores can sometimes decline, which is perfectly fine and normal as more trust is built around the survey deployment itself, and also action being taken on the back end of that. So it's not just surveying for surveying's sake, but it's then actually moving into action and action planning. And when that virtuous circle is happening, we see more truthful scores, which can sometimes mean lower scores. And so I wanted to ask, and Vera, I'll start with you, to this point, and really it's a question to both of you, but starting with Vera, how would you explain some of the higher scores, like on gender-based violence and harassment, that at first glance might seem a bit counterintuitive? Curious to hear your thoughts here.
Yeah, no, thanks. This is a really important point. I think, I'll start with reiterating that ultimately this is a voluntary process. So the participating factories that joined and the workers that opt in might indeed have a more positive perception of the current working conditions. So I think it's important to also note that, of course, every methodology and every data collecting method will always have a gap and a blind spot, and digital engagement has one too. But ultimately, we might have that bias in factory selection. These could be factories that are in general more at the forefront of understanding how to hear from workers and beginning to act on what they learn. And as you also noted, the first survey can be a bit more positive than future ones. We see that trend quite a bit. And that's apart from just building trust. I think the second element there could be just awareness. So it could be that some of these terms or some of these topics might not have been consulted before with workers. And now we've actually raised their awareness about these topics. We've raised an awareness that, verbal harassment is part of harassment. And for example, things related to job progression are important. But the first time somebody hears it, they might perceive it in a bit more, in a way that's not necessarily as open or as honest. They might take a little bit more time to think through, to hear what the results are, and then be asked again. Just because their awareness has increased, they actually might answer with a more negative perception in the future. So I think it's important to also note that part of surveying is raising awareness about the topics, and that could impact results. And then, the very similar results between men and women, and in some contexts, women perceiving some of these topics more favorably. For example, in one of our factories, men thought that women, that men are paid more than women, more so than women. So women thought that there was greater pay equity, but men perceived that more negatively. So why does that happen? And I think we see this in apart from global manufacturing supply chains, we see this in salary negotiations. Women tend to negotiate less than men, and I think this goes around the world. It's not a very context or sectoral specific issue. I think it's general, and I think one of the reasons that need to be explored further is also women's perceptions of what it means to show you're not accommodating, what it means to show you are not happy. I think women can be more socialized to try to accommodate their current situation, and therefore their perceptions might come out as more positive, even if their condition is less positive. So I think that's something to keep in mind. But ultimately, it's maybe I'll end on this note. We did find in one of the factories where we were able to do on-site engagement that we probed further why certain questions, such as those on sexual harassment, were skipped. And we did understand that there is less awareness related to gender-based violence and harassment. So even though there was an absence of very negative answers, there was a strong presence of questions being skipped, meaning the worker preferred not to answer because they could be unfamiliar with the topic. They might feel it's too sensitive. They don't want to answer that on a digital survey. So that's an important finding. I think in one of the factories we had about 32% that skipped one of these questions. So I think that in itself becomes a data point to explore further.
Thank you, Vera. Yes, and we'll turn to Bijie. Similar question, Bijie. Were there any areas that were surprisingly high, and some thinking around why that could be?
Thanks, Lauren. I wouldn't say surprise, but I think it's definitely worth further exploring the fact that women generally give better rating on grievance mechanism compared to their male colleagues. One common scenario, and I think that applies to the factories that we have surveyed in the pilot, that the factories are predominantly female workers, and women workers feel more comfortable speaking up, and they usually get responses from management. And so they trust that their grievances are being handled. And we know that these 3 factories that we surveyed all have a digital grievance tool, and then they have pretty good utilization. So we trust that there is a system in the factory, and that's probably why the women score better than men. But another scenario I wanted to point out, and that is also something that I have experienced in other factories which are not in this pilot, that it could be a result that women are less aware of when to speak up and how. I recall from one of my recent factory experience. So we interviewed a group of women, and we were asking them about their experience communicating with their supervisors. And if they had any complaint or if they have any suggestions regarding that communication. And everyone said that was perfect. Until towards the end of the session, one worker finally spoke up, and she said, I don't know to which point I should complain, because it is quite normal for my supervisors to yell at me if I made a mistake, because he's supposed to manage me. So this kind of perception, I think, indicates that a seemingly good score from women could also mean that women are less aware of their rights, or that they are more adaptable or tolerable to a certain circumstances compared to their male colleagues. So it would be really interesting, I think, if we further understand the factory's conditions through other assessment tools, for example, the SelfDiagnostic Tool, or focus group discussion, or even looking at their grievance mechanism data to find out how their training program looks like for women, right? How women use the grievance tools. So if we're able to piece these information together, it will be easier for us to identify where the gaps are.
Okay.
That's a great point, and maybe I'll just add to that. We've in other experiences we found that there is some correlation to when female scores might be lower and the existence of a worker committee or gender-based a women's only committee in the factory. When there is an association or a gender-based organization that advocates for women in the factory, we sometimes see a correlation with lower scores, because it could mean that socialization and awareness raising is much stronger at the factory. So women know when to speak up, they know where to go, they could potentially act as a collective. So that's also an interesting learning that ties to what you were saying, Bijie.
Yeah. Thank you both. And I think important to note here too is that this effort overall was really meant to start to shine a light on a different way of asking questions from women. It was not meant to say these, we recommend prioritizing these certain areas of intervention. It's meant to be a tool that then the first pass at these nuanced questions that now ideally will scale And we'll test them in more factories and get to a deeper level of insights. So it's not meant to be prescriptive in where factories should move now, but rather how we should better listen to women around the priorities that most matter to them. And that was the effort we undertook in this work. So to that end, I wanted to move us along to the fourth learning, which is there's deep value in data layering here. And what we mean by that is, we've mentioned now a few times the SelfDiagnostic Tool, which is it was just a supplier gender self-assessment questionnaire. So we've heard from managers. And in this process, we contextualize that with this worker voice data in a selection of the factories in which we piloted. And so that allows us to hear from the managers and the workers. And we see, I just want to walk us through briefly what we saw in that process of hearing from both and comparing them. And the why behind this is that when you can look at that data together, we have deeper insights, comparative value of tackling blind spots where managers and workers might differ. And then that can lead to better action planning eventually, which can come from this process. And so the 4 areas I would just raise quickly on this is, where did we see managers scoring high and workers scoring high? And again, caveated with very small sample size here. But where are they both scoring high, meaning actions are compared to other areas, actions are being taken, and workers can sense that this accountability and trust is present. This is in, as mentioned, gender-based violence and health. This is not to say the work is done there. It just means that compared to other areas, this is where we see the highest scoring domains. Where do we see where managers are low and workers are low? So not much is happening in terms of best practice in policy and practice, and workers are unsatisfied. Care. That's where we're seeing low. Where managers rank high and workers rank low. So this is where managers think they're doing comparatively more in best policy and practice, but workers are dissatisfied by and large, is pay. And then where managers are scoring low and workers are scoring high, which is a curious category, is where it could be where there are non-formalized practices and where potentially outsized action or one action has an outsized effect. And we see this a lot in transport. So that gives you just a view of some of what we're trying to sift through. But this requires more information and more conversation and broader scaling. So simply wanted to turn briefly, because I'm mindful of time and I know we would love to get to some of the Q&As. Vera and Bijie, just curious to hear from you a little bit around the value of this triangulation process and what you saw both in terms of the factories in which we deployed both, and also how you can see the industry moving forward using this for more action, which is really where we want to get to in this process moving forward. And so Bijie, maybe we'll start with you on this question.
Sure. I actually talked to one of the managers about this SelfDiagnostic Tool, and then he told me that it is really helpful for him to structure the thought process about what should be put into place. For example, the policy, systems, procedures, etc. It is very helpful to identify what is missing currently in the factory and what needs to be developed. But he does mention that it does not tell him whether what they currently have is working or effective or not. So we complement that with a worker voice tool. So they really see each other as a complementary tools. And from the workers' responses, management can really reflect on the systems and find out where the missing pieces are and can make their system and practice better. I think it's relatively easy to comprehend when we see a higher self-diagnostic score and a lower worker voice score. For example, if the management claims that they have a fair compensation policy, but workers do not perceive that they will get paid for doing the same type of work, then I think something needs to be done to identify where the gaps are. And we also see another example would be that management often claims that there's a functioning grievance mechanism in the workplace, but workers do not feel safe reporting it. Then it's probably because the mechanism is not known to most of the workers, or the workers are not getting a response from the mechanism. So the mechanism is not working. And what's really interesting is that sometimes we see that in factories where workers have higher awareness, I think to Vera's early point about their rights, they give lower scores because they see the improvement opportunities. which also highlights the importance for us not to use the survey as a judgment tool, but an improvement-based tool. And on the other hand, I think if the workers' perception are higher than the management self-diagnostic tool, then I think it's usually because there's a lack of awareness or there's a trust issue. And it ties back to our previous discussion on the seemingly high score given by the workers, which could be a sign of workers lacking awareness of their rights and what their employers should provide in order to protect them. So I think to tackle this gap, management can think about working on developing a system that is missing and definitely educating workers about it.
Vera, is there anything you would add?
Yeah, I would maybe only add that it would be important to broaden beyond the supplier self-reporting process and the worker voice engagement through digital or other means, but to really look at more comprehensively all data sets, right? We are collecting information from audits. There are also grievance mechanisms in place. I think a lot of the factories we piloted in, they also have grievance logs and really looking at the different data sources and triangulating between them to find patterns or to make better decisions. So for example, if many grievances are coming in about one topic, deciding to focus a worker survey, digital survey on that topic, or vice versa. If you're finding a certain pattern in surveys over time, then really beginning to dive into why are we not seeing grievances related to this? And are there any patterns that we can catch before they become a big risk? So this is where the survey could be an early warning mechanism to actually prevent grievances and complaints. So I think this is where it was just an invitation to look beyond the supplier assessments and the worker digital engagement, but to broaden to all other data sets that you might have that might not be all standardized. It would take some normalization of the data, but it's worthwhile to look for those patterns.
This is a great point. And I think, yes, and I do see a question in the chat, which we'll get to soon, around using the tool in its entirety or in pieces of it. I think it's made of a public good. So the intention is it can be used in multiple forms and formats. So if our goal over time is we're in the piloting process. So there's an invitation to use pieces of it that make the most sense for your areas of inquiry. Over time, we would love for us to standardize as a community, to standardize these questions. And so we can have comparable data across brands and across suppliers. But they can be used in a piecemeal fashion now or in their entirety, depending on need. But over time, we would like one consolidated data hub where we can be comparing. The final learning, which we'll go quickly through, is the action planning that really needs to come from this, and that's our hope. And that this is a diagnostic. It can be complemented with a self-diagnostic tool, which is a supplier SAQ. But really, how does this lead to action? And it might feel potentially unsatisfying for the answer to be maybe more research is needed first. But that's to Vera's point just now. It can be potentially an early warning tool, an early warning diagnostic. And it can also be a guiding light in action planning. I think what it's surfaced is curiosities as in a deeper way of listening to workers. And then what this can then lead is a virtuous cycle of deeper dialogue, deeper social dialogue between factory managers and workers. And so our hope is that, and our hope for the industry is that we can scale this more broadly across more factories, test and continue to improve these questions. They can be standalone or fit into other worker survey methodologies as they stand. Combine these and really put them in one data source so we can have comparable insights over time as an industry. And it helps with year-on-year reporting. So we can be comparing worker sentiment and factory manager sentiment over time and see increases or decreases, and then interrogate why. And that just requires further work in the space. Wanted to quickly, before going to Q&A, I know we have just a few minutes, but quickly, Vera and Bijie, any comments you'd have on next steps for the industry here on action taken that you hope that folks will walk away with and use this tool to achieve?
Yeah, thanks. I very briefly, as you noted, the work begins now. I think the diagnostic is a diagnostic. I think now we dive deeper into the why. We saw quite a bit of interest from some of the suppliers to explore further, which has resulted already into further engagement with workers and a focus on the topics that where workers shared they feel more pessimistic about. So we already are seeing that kind of openness and development of corrective action plans and something that can give more depth and breadth to this data. And I think all brands should consider that the survey alone will not be the end of it. I think it's just the beginning of the work, but there's so many tools and so many great organizations that build methodologies and are experts in the space that can help brands and guide them along, and also work in partnership with suppliers, because we're all in this together. So knowing the results helps guide us on a path, but it's going to be collaborative work from now onwards.
Maybe just one additional point from me. I think I would encourage brands and factories start to be more curious about the results rather than, the survey results, rather than just taking the results for granted or simply making the judgment about the factory simply based on the survey results. For example, when you see a perfect score, do not assume everything is fine in the factory, right? There needs to be different triangulations of the data. You need to contextualize the results with other information that you have gathered from the SelfDiagnostic Tool or focus group discussion or the grievance mechanism. So I think it will help you to get the missing pieces together and really understand what is going on in the factory and provide improvement strategies. I also think that ICRW and other stakeholders can think together about having a guideline to instruct the brands and factories on the actions to be taken, on the areas to look into, right, based on the triangulations of the data from the different resources.
Mm-hmm. And so briefly looking at the chat questions we have, and apologies for not having more time today, I would note that yes, survey fatigue is a very real reality in this space, and we fully acknowledge that. The intention of this work is to long-term view is to make it more nuanced and meaningful. And we're deeply working with vendors like Ululu and Labor Solutions who are in the space to dovetail our efforts more seamlessly. I wondered quickly, Bijie and Vera, if you'd be able to speak to why was it not a random sample and cell phone technology, and was that a limitation to participations? Maybe we'll start with you, Bijie.
Yeah, so we made sure that the survey was open to all of the workers. So all of the workers with smartphone, they can freely scan the QR code that was provided for them. So obviously workers would be participating in the survey on a voluntary basis. And if they passed by, they saw the poster, they're intrigued and they would participate. But of course, we tried our best to make sure that worker understands anonymity and also the safety of the survey and what the survey is about. But during the process, there is a voluntary process. And it could be that the workers who are voluntary to participate survey tend to be more likely to speak up in the factory.
Thank you, Bijie. And Vera, could you speak to how the factory managers presented this work to the workers? I know we at ICRW created some curriculum to help them in that translation process to say what is coming, what is this process, but any contextualizing of how the messaging was given to the workers, and any expectation again of change that would come from this.
Yeah, I think we were very clear with the entire working group that we need to have an introduction to the survey that doesn't set the wrong expectations. So to say what the survey is and what it is not. As an ICRW led effort with the working group, we are not necessarily in the day-to-day, and we cannot make those decisions on behalf of the employers. What we can do is share those learnings. And that was an expectation we did set with the workers. And there was a guidance, kind of talking points provided to all of the managers that deployed the survey to communicate to the workers about what the purpose of this is, and again, how will results be treated. Some of the factories made greater commitments to say we will communicate what we learn. Others might choose not to do that. I think that in the end is the decision of the employer. And then also with, for example, we had one particular factory that is progressing towards an action plan. So we perceive that if we were to deploy this again later this year in that factory, we might see much higher participation because workers will see that some action is developed from the results. If an employer does not communicate what they learned and what they might do about it, we might see some attrition, and that's fair. Why would workers participate if they don't know where their feedback is going? So the biggest incentive that we used here is the fact that the really encouraging the suppliers to communicate that there will be a potential review of current policies and their execution. And we'll see. We're just in the beginning of the pilot. We'll have another round of surveys later in the year, and that might help us draw some conclusions.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one point here that I think simply just communicating about the survey results to the field workers, if you can't deliver a solution immediately, but simply just communicating about the findings will really motivate workers to take part in the next survey. We have seen this trend in our previous work as well.
Excellent. So we are at the hour. And I would invite all to visit the ICRW website to find the questions, as well as some training tools that will be uploaded that came from the work in this working group. And what's next is more brands and suppliers testing the open source questions that you'll find there. Again, this can be done with vendors like Ululu, Labor Solutions, others, and it can also be done in-house. We will be hopefully working in partnership on investigating some of these deeper root causes that have come from this research. Over time, our intention is to build in partnership a way, ideally a database to compare both our supplier diagnostics in terms of management as well as workers, so we can have industry level insights over time, realizing that is no small task. So that will take time in the industry to build. We are at step one of that process in right sizing this tool. So we invite you to come to our website to view these questions and for deeper dialogue with all of you. So with that, I want to thank Vera and Bijie, the team at ICRW, the external advisors we've had in this project, and importantly, all of the brands that have partnered with us and their suppliers in this process. So a big thanks to the Gender Equity Worker Engagement Group and all of your respective teams for making this next step in the industry on gendered worker voice. So thank you all. Have a fabulous day. And thank you to OECD for hosting us and this panel. Take care, everyone.
Everyone.